All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for those of us who are joining us in person. My name is Tony Zanders, and I'm honored to be the moderator of today's session entitled Diversity is Not a Webinar, Navigating the Library Industry in the Age of DEI. We're going to begin today's panel with a round of introductions, beginning with the first person to my right, Regina Bourne.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad that you're here this afternoon and joining in online. My name is Regina Bourne, and I am with the University of Cincinnati Libraries. My role there is the Director of Organizational Development and Community Engagement. My primary responsibilities are to implement strategies that will close organizational gaps and help us to create a sustainable culture of DE&I. This would include the growth and development of all of our organizational members. In addition to that, I am also the DE&I liaison, and I work with and are a part and a member of the team of our Vice President for Equity and Inclusion's liaison team and help to implement initiatives and strategies coming down from the organization. I am an HR professional. I have been in HR for close to 25 years. I have had the opportunity to be in many roles in HR, from being a generalist, recruiting, on the labor relations side, the training and development side, also holding positions in leadership and management. I have a background that comes from a variety of different industries, including the private sector, the nonprofit sector, organizations from size as small as 6 to as large as 3,000. So I have a very broad perspective when it comes to DE&I and what's been done throughout the years. That's a little bit about me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Regina. We'll now hear from Elaina Norland.
Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. I'm Elaina Norland. I'm currently work at the Association of Southeastern Research Libraries. I am a professional development and diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinator for 38 member libraries in the Southeastern region of the country. I am also a librarian for about 20 years. I'm a library mutt, I always like to say. I started off as at the University of Arizona, where I received tenure. I was more on the public service side. I left there and went to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, where I was the senior program officer for the Laura Bush 21st Century Library Program. I left that and I worked at OCLC, where I was the member liaison for the member libraries in Maryland, Virginia, and the DC metro area. And I spent about 9 years of my life down in Broward County as the executive director at the African American Research Library and Cultural Center. And then recently I published a book that's at the ALA store as we speak, and it's about employee engagement and building morale within our organizations. And so I come from the DEI perspective, looking at it from a systematic and more of an OD perspective in terms of building and strengthening our library foundations.
Thank you so much, Elaina. We'll now hear from one of our panelists who is virtual today, Stephanie Garrett. Are you there, Steph?
I am. Hi, and thank you so much for the introduction. Sorry that I can't be there in person, but as Elaina just said, I'm actually based, as she noted about DMV, that's where I'm hailing from today in Washington, D.C. So I'm Stephanie Garrett, and currently I serve as the Director of Technology Product Management at Sage Publishing. And I've been with Sage Publishing for about 6.5, nearly 7 years, in various roles, developing streaming video collections and other digital content collections sold to libraries, in addition to software services. Before that, at Sage, I was at other providers and partners to academic and research libraries, including American Physiological Society, as an online journals manager, and at Alexander Street Press, where I got a chance to start my career developing archival collections and developing content collections that could be leveraged and used by libraries, and also brought out the voices and stories of unheard folks from around the world. So in 2016, I also took on the very daunting task of becoming an entrepreneur and starting a podcasting and data services company, PodDB. So I'm coming to you today and talking from the perspective of experience in developing products and services specifically for and with the library market, and thinking a lot about my career and movement in this industry and how I can partner and be with and learn and grow in diversity, equity, inclusion in my identity, but also how I'm engaging with everyone as I build new services or manage teams who are serving the library market.
Thanks so much, Steph. And similar to Steph, my background in libraries started off at a library vendor. I worked for Ex Libris for about 4 years, went from Ex Libris over to EBSCO. Was there for another 4 years. And then in 2018, decided to start a new company called Skilltype, which is helping libraries to manage talent. Our goal with today's panel was to assemble a group of diverse professionals from a variety of different positions. As you just heard, we have trained librarians on the panel. We have HR professionals who now work in libraries. We have people who come from a vendor background in libraries. And the goal is to present 4 different vantage points into interpreting the events of the past 12 to 18 months. And so now that you have some context for kind of who's presenting to you, we have a series of questions that we're going to rotate and answer. And starting with the first question, which really just is a reflection over the past 12 months, there seemed to be a pattern that emerged in response to the events last summer that sparked a national and somewhat global conversation around the importance of DEI in libraries. And from my perspective, it started with the events that took place in 2020, namely the murder of George Floyd, and then also the murder of Breonna Taylor. And there were protests that we saw, and libraries and also vendors started to publish a series of statements. And these statements were on the website. These statements were sometimes communicated by email as well. But it was sort of, I don't know who was the first to do it, but that was sort of the first part of the pattern was, you know, the way we're going to respond is by updating our website. And then after that, that started a series of conversations. Everyone wanted to have a conversation. And talking about DEI now and talking about the events that took place was something that everyone was comfortable doing. And so we had statements that were put onto a website. Then we had conversations that ensued. That was what I noticed just from my perspective. And I want to see from our different panelists, did you notice any other patterns in response to the events that took place that really sparked the conversation around DEI? And we're going to start with Elaina for this one.
Yes, from a library perspective, that I see, you know, when we initially started doing statements, we also did book clubs, the webinars and the conferences and stuff, trying to get background information about DEI, sort of renewed energy. I kind of expected from being a librarian for 20 years, we tend to be, you know, action oriented. You know, when we're dealing with something, we want to take action, we want to do something. And we naturally go to doing something. And statements is something that we can do. It's visible. It's something that we could actually post somewhere and feel like we're doing something. Book clubs, everything had sort of an action oriented perspective. So that was probably in line of what I thought normally would happen. For my member libraries that I work with for ASERL, a lot of them were doing that. They were doing a combination of book clubs. They were bringing in trainers. They were moving towards action and maybe bringing together a committee, trying to figure out how they can get more educated. Because Another thing that we love to do besides action is training. We love training. We love to do training. I mean, it's not just in DEI, but anything related. Let's do some training. Let's pull together and talk about it. That's kind of what we do as librarians. And so I just felt that this was more of what we would do, and if we're going to try to tackle an issue.
Steph, from your perspective on the vendor side and as an entrepreneur, what did you sort of notice and take away in terms of patterns over the last 12 months?
Yeah, so I think everything said were things that I observed too. I was in my position at that time was freelancing. And so I had this, while I have been at Sage for a lot of my time, I was in the midst at that point of basically working for a few different companies as a consultant, and mainly about product and service development or consulting around my own company. And so what the theme or the thing that I noticed that was occurring was that the leaders at each of these companies were essentially reeling and trying to figure out in real time. So there were these actions that were happening in the background, but also one of the themes I saw were people trying to figure out what their tone and voice would be to the wider group. And it was very difficult. I saw some stumbles of leadership in a small startup that was working in the UK in their communication process to their employees. And it was some of the employees from the non-diverse backgrounds were most upset or impacted negatively by the original communications. So they tried to evolve it to the wider group. But then those messagings from leadership didn't necessarily hit at anything actionable that would be changing around the organization and how it worked. So the way that I would describe something that I saw and was recognizing was this evolution of how to actually make contact and broach the subject of, oh, maybe our group or maybe our company or maybe our department is a part of the problem. It was like, first it was a question, and then as the year went on, it became a statement. And then it turned into, okay, so what are we going to do about it? And that was like a thing that I think I saw at libraries and that I was talking to, but I also saw at publishers and startups that I was working with a lot. And that was more about the leadership. So I don't know I think that's slightly different, but hopefully that's a useful kind of review of that, what I was seeing.
Sure. And I also recall most of the conversations that I was a part of and meetings that I was a part of following up on those events immediately started with this sort of pseudo therapy session.
Yeah.
And it was sort of weird. People asking, so how are you feeling? And I don't know if that's something that you experienced as well, but it was certainly awkward.
Absolutely.
And,
yeah.
You check into a Zoom call or a meeting, you're expected to talk about the agenda of the meeting, and you're kind of in that mental place to focus on the work. And then now all of a sudden, the person on the other side of the call is taking you to a place that you didn't plan on going, and you actually worked pretty hard to kind of restrain and kind of compartmentalize, which leads into the second question of, based on kind of seeing that response, what did you hope the response would be? And were your expectations met? And so for this one, we'll actually circle back around and start with Steph.
Okay. What I hope to see, well, so I guess my most truthful answer is that my expectations are low because of everything that had happened up until 2019. So what I expected or what I'd hoped to happen were that people question themselves about their actual role in basically systemic racism and oppression throughout almost every part of their work and what they're doing in their day-to-day. I hope that that's what was happening. I don't know if that expectation was met. I think that conversations were started and there was recognition of systemic oppression, but I think it's been really difficult for people to, and me included, to actually address on a professional level day-to-day, what biases, prejudices am I bringing into my work? I think that I would have hoped that everyone that I worked with would have reckoned with that more quickly, but the work takes longer. So then book clubs came about and new activities that I thought would not move the needle. Those things became the focus of conversation so that we could all get in a shared understanding. So I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think my expectations, who knows what they should have been, but I guess they were met. That's not really answering it. That's just kind of saying what the journey was like, Tony. I don't know.
Sure, absolutely. Elaina, we're going to come to you next on, what were you hoping would take place as a response to these events?
Well, one of the things that was interesting as I left a very high profile director job just because the organizational structure around the place that I was working at was quite dysfunctional, and they had a sort of a mean spiritedness to the culture. And I kind of felt that there was a different way. There was another way for us, not even as it relates to DEI, but just as it relates to us as coming to work every day and feeling good about being at work, that we could be doing better. And so my 1-year journey of talking to organizations that are doing better and who are doing the work and had made really, really great strides in DEI, I was really excited because the answer really seemed to be that if we spend some time, and it's a very complex thing, really looking within in our organizational structures and our culture and begin to create environments that everybody within the organization, every single person in the organization feels that they're valued, then automatically the DEI work would get better. It's complex, but they would get better. And what I tended to find is DEI tended to be compartmentalized on an island somewhere, let's do a few trainings, let's check off some boxes, that it was separate from what was going on with morale issues and scarcity and lack of resources and other things that are happening. Like it was completely separate, and that there was a BIPOC faculty and staff could solve a problem that is way bigger than what they could ever do, because everybody in the organization has to be part of an organizational change. So what was hard for me and what I was hoping to see is that people could see the complexity of it and approach it just sort of the same way if we approach, we're going to get rid of hierarchy and make a more flatter organization or any other complex change that we would do in an organization, that we would approach it in that same way. And what I found is that, no, we don't want any of that. We just want sort of a Band-Aid check-off list, compartmentalized in a corner situation. And we're hoping that this makes changes. And then lots of frustration when that strategy didn't work. So I was really hoping, and I spent a lot of my time trying to get people to see that DEI affects everyone within the organization. Everybody wants to be included. Everybody wants to feel like they belong. Everybody wants to be appreciated for the value and work that they bring to the organization. And if I'm miserable at work and everybody else is miserable at work, how are they going to have the energy to dedicate to DEI when they don't feel that they're being valued themselves?
I can appreciate the distinction it seems like you're making between the organizational duty towards DEI versus one's personal responsibility. The personal responsibility we have, I think, was what I was noticing. People were trying to take on this burden of demonstrating their empathy and demonstrating their understanding. And they were there aren't many rules around how to do that. And there's a lot of room for error. And that is not a burden that I would expect any one person to try to solve. This is an individual person's responsibility. But the organizational duty of it, I think, is what I was hoping would there be a focus on, to create an environment that people from underrepresented backgrounds could perform their duties on a level playing field. And so, yeah, I appreciate that distinction. Regina, you're an HR professional. You've come from a variety of organizations. What were you hoping would be a response?
Thank you for that question, Tony. So, I kind of want to go back to the first question too about the activities and things that I saw happening after the death of George Floyd. Our organization went through very similar things. As Steph talked about, using the word evolutions and that sort of thing. I did appreciate seeing my colleagues come forth and say, I'm sorry this happened. What do you think I can do? How can I contribute to make things better, make a better society? And there was a willingness, for people to learn and grow. And so I looked at that as a positive first step. The efforts to, we talked about book clubs. There were efforts to have more campus-wide initiatives for people to learn more about DE&I things. There were discussions about, about racism, systemic racism, and that sort of thing. So I think we're all very similar in terms of what we experienced there. Where I believe, there seemed to be the ball dropped just a little bit here was the sense of urgency, because my concern when all of these things happened were that, okay, so, we just saw this happen to this person right here on live television. So no one could deny that this happened. But, as a person of color, I've known that these things have been happening for years. So now that there are people who are able to actually see this happen, and we've got everybody to this point where there is, a sense of, feeling bad or maybe even guilty about it. There, again, we talk about the do something syndrome, and we want to do something. How can we help? And so participating in the programs and doing all of those things, were very actionable and they can be done. But again, over time, that momentum, I believe, has been lost. We're back to business as usual. And that's when time becomes an issue. Really dismantling systemic racism, I don't think ever really got addressed. I believe at the very beginning, DE&I was the focus because those are often things that you say, these may give us some tangible results right here, but really dealing with the anti-racism or that systemic racism, is where there's still so much more opportunity. And so the things that I would like to have seen would be more at, the leadership level, starting with our leadership, our organizational leadership, and just prioritizing. And what I mean by prioritizing is giving those individuals a seat at the table, who can help to really bring about the change, who can help to address those inequities that are going on in the workplace. So I think, again, the initial effort, the desire was there to have the discussions, to begin that journey, as we say, to learn and grow. The actionable items and getting some tangible results at the end is where I think there needs to be more priority. And again, that priority is having the right people at the table for those discussions.
Thanks for that, Regina. To answer the question around my expectations being met, I was personally excited when excited is not the word, encouraged, when people started to have conversations that were about kind of real issues on the experience of sort of being Black in the workplace. But then during the course of those months, I learned about a documentary that was filmed back in 1966. And it's called A Time for Burning. And the documentary featured a former member of the Nebraska Senate named Ernie Chambers. I would encourage everyone to look it up. But it was basically this community organizer named Ernie Chambers, who is now a state senator, who was in conversation with a group of white Lutheran pastors and clergymen who were visiting the Black community to try to build bridges and respond to some of the injustices that were going on in 1965 and 66 and 67. And he responded to the line of questioning to say, you know, what is there that we need to talk about? Nothing that we're experiencing is new. And it seems as if the conversation that we're trying to have is just a stalling mechanism to not actually fix the things that have been going on for decades. And seeing that in 2019 and understanding that it was filmed in 1966 when my parents were, you know, young and vigorous and in their, you know, 20s, it just really threw me for a loop, that sort of like deja vu, like we're having this again in 2019, 50 years later, more conversations. And the irony for me was that this was taking place in the library industry. Libraries manage information, archives, history, all of the books. And yet you're asking questions as if you don't have access to any of this, as if you aren't the arbiters and owners of the information. And that's when sort of that encouragement that I felt started to just sort of deflate. And I realized that this isn't anything new. A conversation is sort of the de facto response, which leads into the next question. What are some of the excuses you heard for there not being much progress? And for this one, we can start with Regina.
Thank you, Tony. So many of the excuses that I hear, and I want to also bring some context here. I keep an HR network of professionals that I worked with previously, and that people that I network with on a regular basis. So I'm bringing all these perspectives and being the voice for them as well. And so the common excuses are usually that they don't know what to do. I'm not real sure what to do, or even, you know, my little voice, you know, what can I do? How would that impact? I don't have time. That's a very big one, you know, especially when it comes to being involved in, you know, what we would call training and development and that sort of thing. If it's not something that is required, then if it's optional, then that's another thing that would prevent people from participating in those type of activities. So usually I don't have time comes up as something very common. You know, everybody's busy, we're overworked, we're understaffed. So again, it's a time factor. Another excuse that's very common is that, well, we're too small to make a difference. Or when it comes to these areas of inequities, when it comes to policies and really our systems, well, you know, then there's another system outside of our system. So our current policies are preventing us from making new policies. We either have to wait on this other group to make a policy for us to then move forward. So it's like a catch-22 there. So those are some of the typical excuses that I hear. You know, if I think about it, you know, my honest assessment when it comes to those barriers is that if there is a will and desire from those people who are in power, those people who have the political capital, you know, those people who have position power, these things can be accomplished, you know, in particular, if you have the right people that are in the room. So I think you have to have the right people at the table to begin with, you know, whether that comes from those people and those policy, you know, that make those policies, those structures that may be maybe at another level. So if I look at from a university perspective and how we're organized, well, if it can't be done at our local HR, then we're waiting on central HR. And so I think if you were to have all of these levels of you know, of HR present along with a president and your deans and your provosts all together working on these systems and discussing them, then that's a way to overcome that. So again, it's about having the right people at the table to engage them in the conversations. Also, you know, being willing to have uncomfortable conversations. I think, as my co-panelists have discussed here, there was a willingness to have conversation, when there was such high emotion behind the death of George Floyd. And again, the momentum has been lost. And so what I'm experiencing now, that we're in the room together, in most cases, we're trying to learn, we're trying to grow, we're trying to understand. But then there's still, some areas where we're very uncomfortable with one another, in terms of having those tough, difficult, and hard conversations. So I think, that is one of the areas that would help us to overcome. And, we had to be willing to have those uncomfortable conversations, and we can't be in denial about the injustices that are taking place.
Totally. Elaina, you're in that consortial environment, in contact with a wide variety of types of libraries during the past 18 months. Have you heard sort of any go-to excuses or reasons for lack of movement in these areas?
Yes, the outside of the ones that Regina said, which I do hear quite often, is the committee, some committee had been formed, DEI, EDI, what related committee, what got formed a few years ago. They got frustrated, broke up, and they can't get the band back together. That's quite common. That we tried something a few years ago, it didn't work out. We had a residency program and that person left and it didn't work out. We tried something in the past and that didn't work out. So we're afraid to try it again. And this is something I get a lot of. This is something that the BIPOC staff and faculty should resolve. There seems to be emphasis on recruiting people and then leaving them there, sort of some kind of Hunger Games kind of scenario where if they're unhappy, they need to get together in a group and figure out why they're unhappy. When reality, the what has been going on in the organization, there's a lot of people unhappy. But if they say they're unhappy, then they need to get in a group and resolve the problem. So a lot of times I get, oh, the group is working on giving me some, report or something that tells us why they're so unhappy, which gives you the impression that everybody else is having the time of their lives. And there's only a few people here that are unhappy. And when I asked that, they were, of course not. Most people are miserable. I'm like, well, if most people are miserable, why are you got 6 people in a corner trying to resolve the problem for the whole organization? So I get a lot of these group of people here in a corner, in a committee and in a task force, in a group, in a separate something or another, is going to resolve it. And I also think it leaves people at a disadvantage too, because they're not OD experts, they're not, change managers. They're people who got a master's degree, got a bachelor's degree, decided to work in the library because they were committed to the work. They weren't committed to trying to solve very, very, very complex organizational structures. And so the reason why those BIPOC people end up getting very frustrated and angry and upset about doing the work is because they don't have the expertise to do that kind of work. And it really does require a variety of people to pull together in order to move that change forward. And it can't be left to a group of people who might not have the background or expertise to do that. So a lot of times we got a committee, we brought in a DEI person, we promoted the reference librarian to be the head of DEI when I'm like, they were the reference librarian. So it's a lot of that and they don't know what they're doing. And so I guess we're at a standstill. But a lot of times I always say that we need to take a step back and look at our organization a little bit more critically than this very compartmentalized problem.
Thanks for that. It leads to the next question, which we're going to start off with Steph this time, which is something, it seems like there's this elephant in the room underneath all of these conversations. in the library industry, the master's in library and information science degree, and the role this credential plays. When we look at the demographics, we can see that among the demographics of the profession, most underrepresented people don't have that degree. And as a result, they're limited from certain opportunities for advancement. The higher up in the org chart we go, the more homogenous it gets. And I'm curious, is classism more of a function of what we're teasing at instead of, say, racism? And I'm curious for us to sort of hear your thoughts, Steph. I know you're coming from the corporate side, and so what are your thoughts on the role classism is playing in this?
Oh, thank you, Tony, for that. And Regina and Elena, your comments previously, I just have to say, they feel so relevant to what I personally experienced in going forward in my career of just trudging along, knowing that you're growing your competency professionally and as a product person, a content person, and understanding information science. But that doesn't remotely set you up to understand how you can evolve and create an inclusive culture, even if you might be from an underserved background yourself. And that your comments there really hit home. As far as the classism, and my take on that is that, yes, of course, it must be. Because, and I think this is another part of kind of this conversation is, I think for me, my identity as a Black woman also is wrapped up in my sexual orientation too. And I think one of the things I've noticed is there are class differences amongst that identity and sexual orientation in the queer community too, where oftentimes I'm seeing a difference of, well, how can people from diverse backgrounds who might be of not African descent, how can they be advanced if they have another identity through the pipeline? That's one way that we talk about how we can improve either organizational or market is by looking at different ways to splice identities in order to serve them or to grow the pipeline. And so that's something that I've noticed. I think in my career, I can kind of talk, or I can point to growing in my career from actually just applying metadata that was told to me by a very smart metadata and cataloging librarian about exactly how I apply this information to content. And then within like 2 years of that, taking on managing of a team of 5 to 6 people who were doing that work, I can look back on that time back then and say, something changed about me in that period of time. I went from making a certain amount of money that is very entry level to nearly doubling almost my salary in like a 2 to 3 year. I mean, it didn't start very high, so doubling wasn't very much. But I noticed changes within myself because I was starting to move into different classes of frankly, opportunity and wealth. So the managers and the meetings that I was in, those were more advantageous than they were the 2 years before. So you go for that and you try to find and move up in your career over and over again. The thing is, though, what I found when you look up 13 years later from when your career started and it's 2019 and everyone's asking you what you think, there's not many of me necessarily sitting within the large publishers or on the corporate side who I can say, this is how we all did it. So even sharing in my journey, I have to kind of talk about the class changes that I went through, just living, managing, communicating with people. I literally transformed as a human being working in this industry to make it and to try to be something that was palatable to people as I rise up in my career. So, and I think that we're going to talk more about that at the end, but that's one of the reasons that I found my success is that my adaptability to be able to communicate and to grow the way that I might express myself, I had to really evolve that as class and as opportunity were to grow. Whereas I think that's probably something that is my honest assessment now is that it is more difficult from people who are from underserved communities to maybe have the same career trajectory in the space as I did. And I haven't gotten a handle on why exactly that is, but it seems harder now than it was for me. Sorry, a bit rambly, but there were some really good things said that triggered my memory previous to that.
Absolutely. Coming from commercial vendors, I share a similar experience. The different jobs and advancement opportunities I had weren't contingent upon a credential. I could basically work hard and try to, learn and be responsive and grow and move up the ranks. That's not necessarily the case within the library, where things are a bit more driven by that credential. Regina, working in HR and having to navigate the management of employees who have an MLIS versus ones who don't. What's your take on this part of the conversation?
Thanks for that question, Tony. So you did mention classism, and I do feel that does create classism. I know that I think we've been really good at the libraries in terms of, trying to find ways to bring people in with more diverse backgrounds, not solely relying on the MLIS. So I think we, are very forward thinking when it comes to that sort of thing. But I do believe that again, when we're talking about elephants in the room, I believe that there are some elephants in the room. One of the elephants that I think is in the room is the tenure structure. Now, whereas, and again, I'm not trying to offend anybody here, but whereas I think, there's been lots of good things that have come from that, but I think one of the cons is that it does prevent an organization from moving in new talent. And if we are trying to recruit people of color, and in particular trying to reach down and get, people in the next generations, that's something that I think we need to think about and as an organization in higher ed. So that's one of the areas. I think the other thing about classism, when we think about classism, and I'd say the most recent thing, if I just look at what happened in the most recent gubernatorial race in Virginia. So we have a former governor who ran again for the office to be governor again. And this was an individual that has position power, financial resources, and all of the things at his disposal. And he promoted diversity. He promoted a platform of diversity and wanting, to see a world, that would address social injustices and all of those type of things. But then he ran and used his position power, and he used his financial resources to defeat his opponents, who were people of color. In the primary, there was a Black female and a Black male that ran against him. So I think when it comes to, what people in those positions and what they're saying and what they're doing have to match. So I believe that we have to be ready to have those discussions. And it really is about being willing to correct injustices by giving up something. So in order to give to someone else, you have to be willing to open the door, let them in, or to be willing to give something. So until that happens, I think we're going to continue to have these type of issues. One of the other things that I wanted to touch on when it comes to these credentials and those type of things, we talk about recruiting and being able to get to the next generation of people of color to bring them into the library profession. And I think there are some good efforts that are being made out there. There's programs that are taking place, mentoring programs and that sort of thing. But I think where these programs miss the mark is that they don't address the wealth gap. So, you can bring someone in, you can introduce them, to the profession and those type of things. But when it comes down to closing those gaps, addressing the systems, that those systems and many times of despair, especially when we're talking about outreach, we're not addressing the wealth gap. So we're asking someone to go and get a college degree. And in most cases, you're talking about, those students that are out in the community do not have the financial resources to go get a degree. So there is a need for more scholarship money, to be able to, help those students to be able to achieve that desire if they do want to come into the profession. And so I think there has to be an understanding, first of all, that it's not just about having someone there, a person of color, but actually helping them with those resources that they need in order to get that degree. So those are some of the areas where I would like to see some improvements. Other words, we're ending up, getting these students of color going right back into the academic system where they are taking out student loans. And then there's this big financial albatross around their necks after they graduate, trying to pay off getting this degree. So I do believe that those are some areas that we need to improve upon.
You just reminded me of a story. I'm going to go off script here just for a moment. Not that any of this was scripted, but our questions were. But you just reminded me of, days being strapped down with student loan debt. And this was actually my first job at Ex Libris in libraries. We were traveling to a conference, and no one told me that when you check into a hotel, you need a credit card. You need something to hold the room. And so all my colleagues go in, they got their, American Airlines cards and all the points and the Marriott points, and they're all off expecting to go from the cab straight up to the room and back down for dinner. And I'm sitting there looking crazy, trying to figure out how I'm going to hold the room. And they're like, why is Tony taking so long? They didn't even understand that I didn't have a credit card. And so I'm scrambling, I'm trying not to be embarrassed. And so I wind up calling the office manager who was in Displays at the time, say, hey, thanks for booking the room for me. I actually can't get into the room because I don't have a credit card for the different potential charges. And so I have to wait for her to do this credit card form she had to fill out, and she had to fax it over or something. And so I just had to make up some excuse that, all right, guys, I'll be good. Fortunately, one of my colleagues kind of had the discernment to understand what was going on and discreetly asked me, hey, I'll just put this on my card. Don't worry about it. But from a policy perspective at an organization, if you're going to try to promote people into travel-based roles, these are the types of things that if you are recruiting people of color or from, backgrounds that aren't typically represented, someone has to be at the table when you're crafting these policies that say, hey, if we're going to send these people on the road, we have to make sure that the company's taking full care of it. There's similar stories around expecting people to pay for things in advance and being reimbursed after, as opposed to covering it in advance. Can go on, but a lot of this does have to be discussed at that policy level in order for people to be able to perform their work and their function, which I guess we got to hear from Elaina on this question of the MLIS. And I think your experiences have a unique perspective here.
Yeah, one of the things, a frequent question I get all the time is where this whole concept, even if you're looking at it less from a DEI perspective, but changing the organization to be better, is overwhelming. It's overwhelming, especially when you don't know where to start. The culture of the organization has been around way before you walked in the door. The trauma, 30 years ago, this happened, Elaina, that kind of thing, all of that was there way before you got there. So people commonly ask me well, what can we do right away? And one of the things that I noticed in some of my member libraries is that they are wonderful people right there that are BIPOC staff who have a wide range of skills and talents that are right there. And most people don't really even know them. I mean, they're the circulation people. They check out the books. They're this, they're that. And they're doing that level, but they're not really being seen. And so I said, the quickest way, it's cheap and it's really, really, really effective. From when I used to be a director, it's not, you can't do it enough and it doesn't cost much money. And that's recognition and praise. Seeing people who are not normally seen, right? Shining a light on someone who's not the superstar in the organization, but the person that is quietly doing their job and going away. You never know what kind of skills and abilities they have. I was talking to one of the professional staff, BIPOC professional staff, in one of my member libraries, which I won't say which one. And he was saying that he was thinking about getting a library degree, but nobody ever came to him and asked him about it. And I was asking him about his background. He said, nobody's ever asked me about my background. He told me that he had a bachelor's degree in education and a master's degree in instructional design. And he said, oh, I don't know, is this valuable within libraries? I said, you have a master's degree in instructional design? And interesting enough, that particular member library had just been in a meeting where they were like, we need more people with instructional design. There he is at the circulation desk with a master's degree in instructional design that nobody even knew, because nobody's talking to him. Nobody sees him. He just does his job and he goes home. So how much in terms of when we say that we're building the pipeline and that we're not looking at people who we are, like really looking at them beyond the job description, beyond the day-to-day. Who are they? What do they bring to the table? We might be able to cultivate the people that are right there, and not just BIPOC people. What are we doing as an organization to really see everybody, not just the superstars? And I say that very candidly. I used to be the superstar in the organization. So I'm not saying it in a such a way. I was always the shining star. But when I learned when I was as a director, my job was to see everybody who's not the shining star. You know, the shining stars will always get their accolades, but it was my job to go sit down with someone who I know wasn't being paid attention to and pay attention to them. And it's cheap and it doesn't cost any money. And I always say, I leave this with always a story that when I had people do large projects for me, I used to write them handwritten notes, say, I saw what you were doing. I saw all the wonderful things that you did. I noticed you. And they would still have all of my letters in their office posted around the room. It didn't take me that much to write that letter, but the impact of how they felt within the organization was 10 times. So when I say about classes, we really do need to, there's such an apathy within our organizations. And it's not our faults. I mean, it's a lot going on, scarcity, limited resources, doing more with less. Some departments are good, some departments are bad. Some managers are great, some managers suck. It builds a level of apathy within our organizations that we don't care. But if we're going to make strides, real strides, beyond the book clubs and the statements and the checkoff lists and the pipelines or whatever that is, we need to treat our own people better. Because going to the last thing about pipelines, which makes me really mad, because people are not pipelines. There are people who decided to go and spend their hard-earned cash and time to get a master's degree, to come work in the library when they could do a lot of other things with a master's degree. And they decided to come into the library. They're not pipelines, they're people. But the number one thing that we do need to think about is how we're treating people when we get into the organization, because how we retain people and how we treat people will bring more people to our organizations, regardless of whatever organizations we are. We will attract better people when we start treating our own people better.
That reminds me of one of the principles from a book written by a famous restaurateur named Danny Meyer. The name of the book is Setting the Table. Danny Meyer is the founder of Shake Shack and like 4 other extremely successful restaurant chains in the country. And he wrote a book basically sharing his strategies for success. And the basic principle was that if you want your staff members to take care of your customers, you first have to display what that care looks like for your staff members. And so you have to take care of them. And if you take care of them, they're going to take care of your patrons. And that's a practice that he's proven. In our remaining 3 minutes, just wanted to whip around and hear a silver lining from each of you, because in spite of everything that we've discussed over the past 18 months, something still keeps us here. Something keeps us working in libraries, passionate about our work, investing in ourselves and our organizations. What's one thing that, in spite of everything that you experience, wakes you up in the morning, keeps you excited and interested in this work? And for this one, we'll start with Steph.
Great. I'm glad you're starting with me. I definitely had an answer prepared in mind right at the second. So I think if it's singularly one thing, it's probably feedback that gets me up in the morning. Ultimately, I am in a position where once I make an action, there are lots of reactions around me, either from staff, from colleagues, from vendors, from libraries. I'm in a very privileged position to be able to make a change or to make an action and that have meaningful impact. I'm just getting started on what I'd like to do in the higher education and academic space and with libraries. I just figured that out at this point in my career. And I think what gets me up in the morning is like the next phase of improving that experience for education and for libraries. I think I have the capacity to be able to do it in the next 13 years of my career. So that's it. I'm going to pass it over.
Making an impact. Thanks, Steph. And I'm also going to piggyback on your answer. I think the ability to make an impact is it's very encouraging and inspiring to know that we can make a difference. So that's what gets me excited and keeps me here and keeps me encouraged. Regina, what's one thing that keeps you here and keeps you doing your best at your work?
Well, I have a few things, but I guess if I had to say the one that really gets me up in the morning is I really love what I do. I love that at the end of these strategic plans and the projects that there are going to be some results. And I believe that there is a willingness for change. And so that's what motivates me. I'm encouraged by the messages that I'm hearing from our organizational leaders, all the way up to, the university's president. I'm encouraged by that. So I think there's some mechanisms in place. There's an effort for accountability. And so I think that helps me to enjoy my work and help me stay encouraged and focused on seeing the change.
Thanks so much. And Elaina, save the best for last.
I've been a librarian for 20 years. And as I said in the beginning, I'm a library mutt. I've transformed myself at least 4 times now as an academic library, federal, special, consortium now, public, special, I was director of an African-American research library. I've traveled the world as a librarian. I've sat in huts and worked with librarians one-on-one. I've been to Australia several times. It's been a career that has allowed me to do what I really love to do, is to learn things to help support people and provide that training and knowledge, not only just nationally, internationally. It's been a wonderful ride. I'm not saying that wasn't bumps in the road. I'm not saying I don't have my share of trauma and racism that I experienced, but overall, when I've had people write me letters and said that was something that you said made an impact on my life, or I've we changed something based on what you said, and we changed our organization, I feel that that's my life's work. And I feel like I still have things to say and things to do.
Awesome. I appreciate everyone's candid thoughts and being vulnerable today on our panel. We want to thank the Charleston Conference for hosting this lively discussion, along with thanking the folks who decided to come in person and virtually. I hope everyone has a great week and enjoy the rest of the conference.